Everybody. We will have these BMPs up on our website as they're being published. A lot of what I'm going to be talking about is focusing around those. We will also email it to the group too. So I was just going to suggest that maybe Joe could get us information on that that webinar that he was talking about. We can share that with the group too. So I'm going to start with, before we get start with a poll. So Leslie, pop that up. A couple of things I just want to emphasize. One, in the presentation today, and then two, that it should be an emphasis throughout all we do in urban forestry. So ready when you are.
You want me to post the one about the inspection of purchased trees purchased?
Yes. Do you complete a quality inspection of trees purchased prior to accepting and planting those trees?
Yep. All right, so that's open so folks can respond there if they've got it. And then also Mindy posted the link to the Davie Resource Group webinar that Joe was referencing. But just give folks just a few more seconds to respond and I'll close it. And here we go. I will share the results. Looks like 80% or 86% of the attendees said they do complete a quality inspection of trees prior to accepting and planting the trees. Only one or two folks selected no, and then a handful of folks said they were not sure.
Wow, that's great. Good to hear. So a point of emphasis, and I'm glad to hear that's the case. And okay, so the next one, again, too, I'm interested as a point of emphasis here to see, does your community have a citizen tree advisory committee?
All right, so that is launched, so everybody can respond there. Select yes, no, I don't know. No wrong answers here, just to give us an idea of what's going on in your community. All right, I think we've got most everybody's responses in, so we'll share that. Looks like we have 39% say yes, they do have a citizen tree advisory committee, 48% said no, and 13% said they are not sure.
Okay, well, I always like to look at the positive. So good on the 39%. I suggest that it's an important and very valuable part of storm preparedness and recovery and response, but also urban forest management. So, okay, so let's get to storm response. The storm is hit, right? And we went through readiness planning on Tuesday. Now it's in your hands. You should have the tools there, but ultimately, you're going to have to go to work. You all do already, I'm sure. But so I'm going to start with, the safety message. Safety first, right? For our public, your staff, and yourself too. So safety first. So we're going to begin with using our ICS structure, ICS organizational design that we've used as our structure through this planning effort and your response team structure to walk through the chain of command and chain of tasks on your response, from the pre-storm all the way down through your emergency phase to your late response phase to demobilization. And just one caveat here, obviously I pop up that if we got a forecasted event, I'm sure you all do, but stage those resources, get some people on standby and ready to go. So once the event happens, as we mentioned, you're going to do your initial damage assessment. Windshield survey, as Joe was talking about, and I mentioned earlier, we're going to go out and do a general assessment and assess resource needs to then come back, and either your team leader was doing that or bring on your team leader and you want to classify that event, right? So class one being damage can be handled by just your forestry team, all the way up to the most severe event, that class three, where you're going to need regional state assistance, Class 2, I'm suggesting would be, an event that's going to require all your community resources. So we have now our general call that tells everybody what we need to do, and it'll initiate mobilization of the resources that are necessary. So we kick off with that mobilization. The other task is we have administrative support. They're receiving calls, storm damage calls from the public or other agencies, and we're using the form that we suggested as a storm call log. Collecting that information, which then they're passing it off to planning and logistics, who is going to transfer that to a dispatch and inspection log, sending it off either to do inspections by our inspectors, who are going to prioritize that work. Get it back to planning, who then, based on the prioritization of what they find, is going to then dispatch it to crews. Oops, I went the wrong way. Where they use their storm call, again, tracking to that call number as I suggested. They take that call, they got the work, collect a little more information, they do the work, complete that work, notify planning and logistics, back to their dispatch log, noting that the crew has completed the work. And that's kind of the chain of events and chain of command of using our structure. We'll talk about tree damage inventory here in a bit. So, all right, now let's get into kind of action planning strategies. And I have a breakout here, as you can see, based on the various classes that we've event classes. So event class, who you're going to mobilize, then what is a general sort of action plan on how you would work through your work in these various types of events. What management units you'll be using, what storm damage assessments you'll be completing, how will tree work be dispatched and completed, how is debris cleanup being done, and then ultimately, when are you how do you make a demobilization decision? What are the next steps? So if we take a little closer look, I wish I could zoom in a little bit, but here, so on, as we said, on a class 1, that's a small event that the forestry team can handle by itself, either a full team or a small one. Management units, they may not be required, or you might be using quadrants. Hazard remediation, calls may be inspected as they're received. They come in, go out, take a look, and then get it taken care of. Or a little more intense, you may need to divide up by quadrant. Hazard survey, windshield survey that Joe was talking about and we did before, it's a possibility that may be required if you've had a fair amount of damage afterwards. But you at a minimum want to do a post inspection of those damaged trees. And your crews are really going to be dispatched by priority, or as those calls come in a lesser scale event. And in terms of cleanup, no, this is small enough that the crews are going to complete the cleanup as they do that work. And ultimately, this workload is going to reach a point that it finishes up, and you're going to be into recovery. On the class 2, step up. In this case, this is going to take the whole community, all of our community resources to respond. And you would be using storm damage management units. You will be doing call inspection by quadrant or management unit, and you're most likely going to do a hazard survey once that call volume drops to the point that you would then go back out and do a windshield survey. Tree damage inventory may be needed, but may not necessarily. You would be, you're going to be assigning crews by geographic management area, and they're going to be dispatched by priority based on what the call inspection has shown. In this kind of level, we're saying our crews are only going to be doing hazard remediation work. That is to take care of the hazard. They wouldn't do any cleanup. They would move on and leave the cleanup for others, which may be managed by other community resources. So this process would continue to the point that the workload reaches that point that the event classification can be reduced to class 1. And then class 3, that's the biggie. We're going to need state, regional, federal resources to assist us. So that's all fairly the same as class 2, but 2 things: you are going to need a tree damage inventory. That comprehensive initial tree assessment damage inventory, like the sample going back, might be something that be requested from FEMA. So that might be something that's going to need to be done. As I say, the rest are all similar. Obviously, the workload you work through till you reach a point that you can reduce your class down to class 2 down to 1, and so on. So a little event action planning strategies to consider based on those. Okay, let's talk about storm damage tree inventory. As I noted on our recovery plan, response planning, this may be late in your response phase or early in your recovery. Late in the response is going to, here your hazard remediations are largely complete, but we're going to be left with standing storm damage trees, various degrees. There will be a push to get this done earlier, and that's why we say late response if FEMA may be involved, because we want to get the funding under the guidelines for public debris cleanup. So that is the real major reason for kind of moving this along as early as you can. It would then be the data collected from that would help on FEMA reimbursement. So what are we doing? We're simply assessing each storm damaged tree, management needs, and obviously this information is going to be useful for budgeting and recovery planning. And we talked about resources available to help you with completing that on Tuesday. So the rest of what I'm going to go through here, you're going to hear similar highlights from Barb, but my focus is going to be around the BMPs to try and lead you through those documents that you can find on it. So I think we're going to have a little crossover or reinforcement from both Barb and I, which is, I think, a good thing. So in our BMP here, it was a 3-step assessment process. The first being, a situational and safety awareness. And that's before you go running up to the tree, take a look around for safety issues, operational issues, and get yourself set. Second was that hazard remediation, trying to quickly take care of the immediate hazards. And we talked about that on Tuesday. Here I'm going to focus on crown loss. And the truth is a tree with significant crown loss can be preserved. It will require more intensive healthcare treatments. It's ultimately a decision of the owner, but the general rule is, and this is a FEMA guideline, if deciding whether you want to have funding to remove a tree, is a 50% crown loss or more. So I ask you though, is it 49%, 45%, 51, 55? It certainly gets a bit subjective. The truth is there are other variables to consider in making that decision. And this following a crown loss assessment is really an effort to quantify the risks to assist you in making a management decision, because it is ultimately, okay, what risks do I have with the choice of preserving a tree? Skip through there. So there are 6 total steps, but first is assess the tree health. A healthy tree has stored energy reserves to close wounds and replace its crown. Conversely, a poor tree in poor health doesn't. And then here, this oak out by NC State is clearly not healthy. It doesn't have enough energy to sustain these branches, so it's shutting them down and it has dieback. So crown loss on top of this is not going to be a good, good for this tree. So it's important to look at health. So what I say is assess the health of the tree and put it into these 3 different categories. You're going to be looking at shoot growth, foliar cover density, wound development, and the absence of or presence of significant branch death, damaging pests or disease, and put it into these 1 of 3, good, fair, or poor. And poor obviously being not good in all of those categories. So assign it to that. A second step is tree age and size. Young and semi-mature trees have a high ratio of energy producing leaf area to their live wood mass. Not a lot of wood mass and a lot of energy producing leaf area. And as a right, they're also storing a lot of energy. And so they've got that energy available to replace close wounds and replace crown loss. On the other hand, as trees mature and get to over maturing, that they have a lower ratio of energy producing area and a lot more wood mass. So losing crown is going to be a much more significant event for them. So along those same lines, I'm going to say assign the tree to an age class, semi-mature, mature, or over mature, based on the species of tree. Next is tree species. Barb will talk a little more about this. I'm showing you a table that's truncated for presentation here, but species decay resistance. Some species are more resistant to decay. They compartmentalize better. As a result, they're going to have a better chance and do a better job at recovery. Next, site conditions. Are they favorable for the species or unfavorable, both environmentally or from a space standpoint? The picture in downtown Raleigh, these are pin oak. They were all planted at the same time. These are in tree pits, and here's a nice lawn area. So what would you say here? Not a good site for a pin oak, right? So using these 2 criteria, I'm saying good decay resistance, good site. That's a good assignment on the species. On the poor end, slight or non-resistant, poor environmental conditions for the species, and even throw in a variable here, it's invasive species, you may want to get rid of it. Rate them on those 3 categories. Next is crown loss distribution, and this is more around what kind of pruning treatments we can use and which are better than others, and also certainly ultimately the amount of crown loss. So I'm suggesting that where we have just broken terminals out of the side and we've left interior lateral branches that are going to have energy that can support the lower parts of the branches, where we have the opportunity to do reduction cuts, and that's better than cases where they're completely stripped out. And so the amount of, say, restoration pruning and heading cuts that may be needed is going to be lower. So the crown loss distribution, I'm going from better to not so good. The second group would be large, lateral scaffold branch loss. Here, you're just going to be looking at pruning those large scaffold branches. Now, typically, we would perform a final removal cut back to the point of origin or the trunk, which will leave a large wound and will never close. And we're thinking it's actually some research saying it's better to actually stub those off at a reasonable point, because then we're going to slow the time that it takes for decay to get into that trunk. Now, you don't want to leave too much, because that is still going to have live tissue that's going to be starving or drawing energy from other parts of the tree. So that would be better than the next choice, which is you get over 75% crown loss, or if that 50% and it's all on one side of the tree here, Potentially, it's more susceptible to windfall. You certainly have possibility of sun scalding on the whole bare side of the tree. This would not be an ideal situation. So this would be the last and the worst of the types of distribution. Here you can see really 100% crown loss on that ash tree. So among those, your 4 results of your assessment, I want to calculate what is the risk of preserving this tree, and give you a general assessment of the qualitative assessment of preservation of that tree. So first being crown loss, less crown loss is better than more, and that magic number of the 50 in the middle here, you know, so if the tree is in good health, it's semi-young, semi-mature, it's a good species, and we've got, you know, even distribution of top damage, you know, that's certainly a low risk. Conversely, you go red on all of them, that's not a great candidate. Now, obviously, the truth is they're going to be in the mixtures of this, but it gives you a good indication of weighting where, you know, your chances are best in making your preservation versus removal decision. So what is that decision? Well, you know, as again, if ultimately it's the decision of the owner. We're looking at this Norway maple with ice storm damage, well over 75%. What are those risks of preservation? Well, it'll decline in health, become a safety risk and die, right? The trees may pose a tree health risk to other trees, prone to more storm damage. As they get opened up, branches are going to be loaded that weren't used to being loaded, so they're going to be more susceptible to damage. And truth is, they're going to require more regular inspection and possibly healthcare treatments. So those are kind of the risks of preserving those trees. Management recommendations, right? We can remove and replace. If we do choose preservation, you should expect that, you know, you need to be inspecting these trees more often, annually. We need to complete the pruning to restore that damage, and possibly healthcare treatments. For our municipalities and large property managers, where you have lots of trees, just consider, you know, funding that you're spending on severely damaged trees is not going to be available for less damaged trees. A large population of damaged trees pose a tree health risk to the remaining population. So your decision is going to be, you know, in the context of the funding you have available, the capacity you have to provide those damaged trees with the care they need, and balancing the recovery plan expenses that you have elsewhere. So a couple other considerations. Historical special trees. Now, you know, there is a good reason that you may want to take the additional expense for and risk. Another, as a city forester, you know, I know that some of our sites out there are really difficult to get trees established. So if you have a relatively healthy tree that's already established there, and maybe you got a lot of storm damage, it might be a case that, you know what, it's difficult to get a tree established there. Maybe I'm going to leave those. Just so a couple of other considerations to think about. Okay, so let's talk about recovery. Planting, pruning, removal. Following our ICS protocol here, leadership, we're going to do a couple of debriefings. We're going to talk about procuring trees, and then a bit about the recovery planning process. So first, event response. So get your urban forest response team together and review your response. Celebrate those things you did well, and fix any deficiencies you found. Review for completeness and accuracy. You know, that hazard remediation documentation. You should have some records of where trees need to be looked at, or if you completed a storm damaged tree inventory, review that and ensure it meets all your needs. If you find any deficiencies, you're obviously going to need to correct those deficiencies at this point. Do that. Otherwise, go ahead and summarize the findings. Then begin the recovery planning process by, I'd say, getting that forestry advisory committee together, share that report with them, and set out a schedule to develop your recovery plan. So that administrative bit about tree planting procurement, purchase quality nursery stock, and I was glad to hear you folks are doing inspection. That's a huge mitigation step for future, avoiding future damage and reducing management costs. Good central SEM on those shade trees. We won't go into great depth about nursery stock. It's in the BMP, planting, equipment and labor, but obviously there are B&B, container, bare root options out there. Recognize that price increases exponentially with the size of the plant, and your transplant losses get larger. Smaller container and bare root trees can also be planted by volunteers, so that is a labor issue you might think about. So you already are doing it, inspect prior acceptance, and let's kind of touch into what should you have in a tree planting and supply contract. And there is an example on our webpage templates for this. So again, quality, garbage in, garbage out. And how do we measure quality? The ANSI Z60.1 American Standard for Nursery Stock. It by type of tree and nursery stock, you'll see in our spec, we spec out what type they should be and what the quality standards should be. Another, particularly in a municipal standpoint, are street trees. You spec them grown for street tree quality and a branching height inspection standard is set. And that is, this particular tree is branched pretty low. You put this out on the street and you're gonna need to prune it already. So good nurseries that are growing stock for street tree use are raising the tree as they grow. So buy it when it's already done, otherwise you're gonna have to do it yourself. Then you're gonna have your planting specifications on proper planting. And then I suggest a pricing strategy similar, and this can be a term contract that could be multi-year, where you put in a supply bid, you have a list of the species you want, what sizes you want, the form, and how many you want, get a unit price for that. Then it comes to planting, specify planting bare root and size, B&B, container, etc. And that will give you a good unit price contract pricing to use for planning, but obviously getting the work done too. And then finally, what are the qualifications of those folks doing the work? So species selection, I want to tell you, I mentioned I got gray hair. I've been around a while. So diversify, select a diverse choices of species, both from a community level and at a street level, I would argue. Here, these are American elm, and Dutch elm disease came in the 50s and 60s and wiped out many of the American elm, most of the American elm, and including in the city, I was in city forester. And here, a street that was American elm was planted with green ash. And this was the 91 ice storm that I managed. And you can see what the ice storm did to the ash trees. This street has seen the loss of American elm, and now they saw the loss of all their ash. And I think many of you also know that ash is also the host to emerald ash borer. So had the ice storm not taken these, EAB would have been a challenge. So diversify. It'll minimize the impact of insects, pests, and disease. And here, storm damage can be species specific. Ash was very susceptible to it. So. All right, so species selection, again, right tree, right place. On your damaged tree inventory, I recommend, I'm going to point out here that you make sure you collect information about replacing those trees. If you did not, i.e. site information on how big the site is it appropriate for what size tree, this is a great project for volunteers. Give them a clear specification and they can get that done. And Barb is going to talk a bit more about storm damage resistance. So, planning, develop your recovery plan and a recovery budget, and then develop your plan are the two steps. So, your recovery budget, you have term contracts in place that have unit costs based on diameter for your various needs, pruning, removal, and we just learned about planting. So develop your preliminary budget. Recognize the term, if you have significant damage, a unit price contract may not be the most cost-effective method, and a lump sum contract may be a more cost-effective option. So assemble your community advisory committee, and I say ask these 4 questions. Can you afford the cost to complete that recovery in 1 year based on that budget? Will it require multiple years? Is there supplemental funding available out there to help? And then, as I just pointed out, is that unit price contract the most cost-effective methodology? So ask yourself these questions based on that budget. Point out here some funding opportunities. There's certainly, we have consulting, education, and outreach. In terms of tree planting, the council, or Forest Council, has the Legacy Tree Planting Fund for projects. A big opportunity is the Arbor Day Foundation, and they have grants specifically around storm restoration. The other thing to think about is create a local planting fund. Local businesses and individuals are readily give to tree planting efforts. So something about. So a recovery plan, 1 year, straightforward. Obviously, you're going to complete the work with your term contract, or maybe you're going to choose to do it via lump sum. A recovery length, couple options on multi-year options. Option 1, complete it in 3 years based on management task. 1, 2, 3, removals, planting and pruning. Option 2 would be to complete it by management unit. So your number of years obviously is going to correspond to the number of management units you have. And going back to our friends in Sanford, they have 5 management units, so this would be a 5-year restoration. Option 3 is to do a combination of management units and then by tasks. In the scenario, the longest would be 5 management units times 3 tasks, or a 15-year recovery period. So working these various strategies based on your budget, arrive at what your recovery plan is. Your final budget based on that implementation schedule. Your implementation plan, you're going to have now your trees to be pruned, removed, and planted. Your term or lump sum contracts in place to get that work done. And then finally, you need to develop a public information plan. We've had our advisory group as a part of this, so the information is getting out, but engaging them in the process is going to help all through this process. Okay, so take homes. Readiness. We have come full circle, and now we are back to readiness. And the 3 R's process, the take homes, I say, are tree risk management. Removing those risk trees is going to mitigate a lot of damage. Maintenance, pruning, young tree pruning in particular, small trees, low cost, and a good volunteer project mitigates future damage. We talked about quality, and species selection, mitigating. And then preparedness. The ICS provides the organizational structure to effectively and efficiently respond to it and to recover from all scales of damage events. I hope you see that. And then develop an urban forestry program, engage the public in that process. And there's a multitude of expertise and resources out there to assist you, including us. All right, so I think we're right on time.